Our story today is about a police officer in Argentina who encountered something completely incomprehensible by the side of the road on one of the paths leading to the agricultural fields. When the officer went to investigate this strange thing that caught his attention, he disappeared for 24 hours. Later, they found him, but when they did, he was in an unnatural state. When his colleagues found him, he told them about the terrifying thing he saw on the fields that night. The officers, upon hearing the story, were so shocked that they couldn't comprehend what this officer had seen. Whatever it was, it's not known what it was exactly, but what's certain is that this officer, from that day on, was never a normal human being again. Since then, he has been undergoing treatment. Some residents of this area say that this story is one of the most unnatural stories ever to happen in this place. So, what did Officer Sergio see on the road near the cornfields in Las Cañas, Argentina? That's what we'll find out in today's episode. If you like this type of story and want us to continue with it, subscribe to the channel and let's continue this episode with 100 likes. Without wasting time, let's begin.
On the night of March 2, 2006, a police officer named Corporal Sergio Pusita, aged 28, was riding his police motorcycle on a dirt road in rural Argentina. It was nighttime and it was completely dark with no streetlights. On the right and left of the road, there were mostly open lands connected to each other, filled with trees, and ahead there were large mountains spread across the entire region, which was completely enveloped in silence. There was no one around him in that area because it was so remote. This area is known as the Pampas, famous for its stunning natural landscapes and its cattle herders. Sergio was out on patrol that night, monitoring hunters who came at night to hunt wild animals like wildcats, monkeys, birds, and other animals. These were, of course, hunted and sold at high prices on the black market, which is definitely illegal. The night was completely calm, but Sergio, with his experience, knew that the later it got, the higher the chance he'd catch these hunters who came out at night, increasing the likelihood of spotting and catching them.
Around 1 a.m., Sergio was riding his motorcycle toward an intersection called de Las Cañas. At the end of the road, he suddenly saw a red light, like the tail lights of a car. At first, he thought the car would stop, but it quickly sped off the road and into the adjacent field, which was full of trees, crops, and corn. The field it entered was about the size of a football field, and then the light completely disappeared. Sergio's heart started racing because he was certain that these were likely the hunters who had noticed his presence, suspected he was a police officer, and fled into the field. Sergio sped up his motorcycle and chased after them until he reached the point where the car had entered the field. He stopped, got off his motorcycle, and called the police station, reporting his location and requesting backup. Then he drew his gun, knowing the place was remote and that backup would take time to arrive. He decided he wouldn't let these hunters escape. He had a flashlight with him, but chose not to use it so as not to reveal his position. As he walked in the dark, he struggled to find any trace or see any sign of the car. There were no broken branches or trampled shrubs. Everything looked natural and intact. So Sergio, aiming his gun ahead, began walking slowly along the path looking for tire tracks. But after searching a long distance, he found nothing, as if no car had entered the field at all.
Here, Sergio stopped in his tracks and tried to listen, hoping to hear any movement in the area since they had only moved a short distance before stopping, meaning they were likely nearby. But while standing there, all he heard was the sound of the wind rustling the trees, the sounds of nocturnal insects mixed with the calls of some night birds and the hooting of owls around him. Sergio realized he couldn't stand there all night waiting to hear them. So he took a deep breath, got up, and started walking, entering among the trees. He moved quickly but cautiously, pushing branches and trees aside with his left hand while holding his gun in his right, his eyes scanning the entire area left and right. After advancing about 30 meters into the trees, he finally saw something out of the corner of his eye. A glint,
as if moonlight was reflecting off something metallic in the middle of the night. He thought, "This must be the car. I've caught them." But when Sergio turned his body toward it, there was no car. What he saw was something so terrifying and unimaginable that he froze in place, unable to move for seconds. As he stood there, the sounds around him in the forest, the owls, animals, and nocturnal birds grew louder and louder. He felt immense fear in his chest, as if a sudden panic attack had struck him. He wanted to scream, but his voice wouldn't come out from the shock. After a few minutes, another police officer, a friend of Sergio's who was off duty and preparing to go to bed, received a call. He looked at the screen and saw it was Sergio calling. He answered, saying, "Hello, Sergio." But Sergio didn't say hello or anything at all. Instead, his voice was cold and strange, saying, "Come to Las Cañas and you'll know what to do." The officer on the other end was shocked, and before he could ask what he meant or what was going on, the call ended. He tried calling Sergio back, but there was no answer. This was very unusual behavior from Sergio, and the officer didn't know exactly what was happening, but sensed the situation was serious. He decided to notify the station to take precautions. When he called the police station, the officer who answered told him they had already sent reinforcements to Sergio because he had called them, reported his location, and requested backup. They added that they were worried about Sergio because they had lost contact with him after his first call, and every attempt to reach him went unanswered.
At the same time, 3 police cars full of officers sped toward the cornfields in Las Cañas, the last place they had communicated with Sergio. When they arrived at the location Sergio had mentioned, they found his motorcycle parked on the side of the road. The 3 cars stopped next to the motorcycle, and the officers got out and began searching the area. One of the officers tried again to contact Sergio via the radio, but there was still no response. They spread out across the entire area, holding flashlights and searching the entire path, left and right, for any sign of Sergio. After about a minute or two, one of the officers saw a pile of metal gleaming on the sand by the road. When he got closer and shone his light on it, he gasped loudly and shouted to the other officers to come quickly. The metal pieces were the completely disassembled parts of Sergio's radio and his gun. After this discovery, they immediately launched a massive search operation in the area. Soon, additional backup arrived, and they began gathering and searching the entire area on a wider scale. After a short time, the officers found footprints that appeared to be Sergio's, military boot prints, moving away from the road and into the trees. The officers cautiously followed these tracks for about 30 meters into the trees and noticed something very strange. The footprints were getting farther apart. At first they thought maybe Sergio was running fast and taking long strides, but as they continued following the tracks, the gaps between the steps grew larger and larger, becoming impossibly wide. The distance between one step and the next reached about 3 meters, then 5 meters, and eventually 6 meters. Even if Sergio was running at full speed and jumping, this was impossible for a human. The officers following the tracks started looking at each other, confused, unable to understand. Each footprint was clear, and there was no doubt it was a human footprint. They were certain they hadn't missed any steps in between. The footprints were indeed spaced out this way. At first, the officers were talking to each other as they followed the tracks, but then they walked in silence, stunned by the situation. They continued following the tracks for over a full mile. The tracks eventually led them from the open lands to an area full of trees and then into a cornfield, where they suddenly stopped, as if Sergio had taken one last step with his right foot and then vanished.
The search for Sergio continued throughout the night, even though it started raining around 2 a.m. This didn't stop the officers from searching until they found their friend and colleague. However, they couldn't find any further trace of Sergio. There was also something else very strange. There was no evidence of the hunters Sergio had reported before he disappeared. There were no tire tracks other than those of Sergio's motorcycle. And the plants in the area showed no signs of a car having entered and driven over them. No broken branches or any indication of a struggle in the area.
There was nothing to explain why Sergio disappeared or why his radio and gun were disassembled. The whole situation was so strange it defied comprehension.
At 3:34 p.m. on March 3, 2006, about 18 hours after Sergio's disappearance, a farmer was walking on his land about 12 miles from Las Cañas when he saw a strange person sitting by the side of the road. The farmer looked closely to figure out who it was and saw a man curled up into a ball sitting in the mud. Keep in mind that this area was so remote that people rarely passed through, so seeing someone there was rare. Out of curiosity, the farmer called out to the person, but he didn't respond. The farmer decided to walk toward him to see what was going on. When he got closer, he realized the person was a police officer, evident from the military uniform he was wearing. The man was sitting on the ground with his knees pulled up to his chest, his arms wrapped around his knees, and his head buried completely in his lap. The farmer was puzzled, wondering who this was and unable to identify him. Another strange thing was that, despite the rain having just stopped and the ground still being wet, this person was completely dry. The farmer gently placed his hand on the officer's shoulder and asked, "Brother, are you okay?" But the officer didn't respond, didn't move, and didn't say anything, as if he were a statue frozen in place. The situation was so strange for the farmer that he stepped back a few steps, pulled out his phone, and called the police. They arrived quickly and identified the officer as Sergio Pusita. But Sergio wasn't speaking. Not to the police, not to the farmer who found him, not to anyone. There were no visible signs of physical injury, but it was clear something unnatural had happened to him. They immediately called Sergio's supervisor and summoned him to the scene to try to get him to talk. When his supervisor arrived, he was at least able to get Sergio to stand up. The only thing Sergio did was hug his supervisor tightly, break down crying, and collapse. They took him from the scene to an ambulance that had just arrived and transported him to the hospital.
In his hospital room, Sergio refused to let anyone approach or touch him and was extremely nervous and terrified, especially of the light in the room, which scared him greatly. After some time, he finally allowed the nurses and doctors to examine him. His supervisor expected he had been injured, kidnapped, or harmed in some way, as the man was clearly not normal. But the situation was strange. When they examined him, they found no injuries, no bruises, nothing on his body. Everything was intact, no wounds, no marks. The doctors confirmed he wasn't suffering from dehydration or illness despite being missing for 18 hours without food or water. The only strange thing they noticed was under his feet. When they removed Sergio's boots and socks, they found strange burns on the soles of his feet, as if he had been standing on something extremely hot, causing his feet to burn from below. But this discovery didn't help them understand what had happened to him, and the man refused to speak. They left him for a few hours and returned, and finally Sergio began to talk, at least a little, and started to tell his story and what had happened to him that night. He told his colleagues exactly what occurred, and I'll tell you the story exactly as Sergio told it.
He said that on the previous night, around 10 p.m., when he was chasing the hunters and entered the trees, he was certain at that moment that he saw the moonlight reflecting off the hunter's car. But when he got closer, he found no car. The only thing he saw was red eyes, like blood, staring at him in the middle of the night, in the darkness, from among the trees. His blood froze in his veins, and he couldn't move from his spot at all. The eyes came closer and closer, and he gradually realized that these weren't human eyes, or even animal eyes. They were the eyes of strange creatures he had never seen in his life. All he could see and describe was that these creatures were very thin, with gray skin, large heads, and long limbs, and they never blinked. He tried to scream and release the fear in his chest, but he couldn't make a sound. At that moment, he realized his body couldn't move from fear. Even more terrifying, he suddenly felt intense pressure on his chest and his back began to bend forward in a strange and frightening way.
He tried as hard as he could to resist the pressure, but it was too strong. He said it felt like his spine was going to break. He struggled to move backward, reached into his pocket, pulled out his phone, and called his colleague. But he said that when he spoke, the voice that came out wasn't his, as if someone else was controlling him when he said, "Come to Las Cañas, and you'll know what to do." As Sergio moved backward, in a strange, hunched-over state, he suddenly felt his hand drop and touch his gun, the one he always carried. Suddenly, he pulled out the gun, and in his terrified state, he stood frozen, watching his hands disassemble the gun right in front of him. The gun broke into pieces and fell to the ground. In the same way, he pulled out his radio, disassembled it into pieces, and threw it on the ground next to the gun, all while the creatures kept staring at him without moving. After disassembling his weapon and radio, he felt the pressure on his chest and spine begin to ease little by little, and he was finally able to breathe. He realized this was his only chance to escape. He took off and ran as fast as he could, but after only a short distance, he felt something hit him hard from behind, so forcefully that he was thrown forward and fell on his face. The thing pulled him back and hit him again, sending him flying forward a second time. He felt something lift him, but this time it threw him even farther than before. This happened once, twice, 3 times. Sergio realized these creatures weren't going to leave him alone until they finished him off. He felt like a toy in their hands being played with. With each fall to the ground, he felt an unnatural burning and heat in his feet. The last thing Sergio remembered was running through the cornfield like a madman, feeling like he was going to die alone in that place. But suddenly, the creatures disappeared. He looked back, exhausted and drained, and saw only the cornstalks swaying with the wind and an unnatural darkness in the area. He turned his face forward and saw something very strange, a pitch-black void, an unnatural darkness where you couldn't see the cornfield, the ground, or any light at all, as if he had reached the end of the world, a place empty of everything. As he stared into this void, he saw the same red eyes looking at him again. Then Sergio collapsed and lost consciousness. He didn't know how, but he woke up 18 hours later, sitting on the side of the road, unable to move or speak from fear. They conducted interviews with him after the incident, but no one could explain what happened to Sergio that night. Even Sergio himself couldn't fully explain it. It's worth noting that Argentina and South America in general are known for having remote areas filled with terrifying things. Because of what happened, Sergio suffered a severe psychological trauma and decided to resign or retire from his job in the police. Sergio's story and what he went through remain a mystery with no explanation. Some people say these might be creatures from another world, as you know, and they caused all these events and attacked him. But to this day, it's truly unknown. Write your analysis of the story in the comments below, and if you like this type of story, let me know with a number of likes. That's it, and stay safe from the red eyes that might appear to you at night. I'll see you in the next video.